The decision to send the division from Nizhnekamskoye eastwards along the northern bank to Gromoslavka, and, in accordance with the order of the Corps commander, to protect the western flank with minimum forces, was based on the assumption that the enemy would hardly throw very powerful forces on such a weak section of the front from our side, and would not cut the supply lines of my division. However, the events of the night of 19 December showed that for the key point of Nizhnekamskoye this assessment was wrong. Before the end of the night I intended to create a bridgehead on the northern bank to ensure the continuation of the offensive. It would not only serve us as a springboard, but would also contribute to the improvement of the situation and the defense of Nizhnekamskoye. The radiograms received at the end of the day from the Army and Army Group headquarters contained wishes for success in this daring venture and orders to pursue the enemy all night without respite. The relevant entry in the division's combat log reads as follows. A night pursuit was out of the question due to the unexpected strengthening of enemy resistance and lack of fuel. The section of the Mishkova River was occupied by large enemy forces, which were constantly arriving. The rapid capture of the bridgehead on the northern bank was prevented by brutal street fighting in Nizhnekamskoye, bridges over the Mishkova River destroyed by the enemy, and icy sections of the ford. The locality was subjected to intense shelling by enemy rocket launchers and tanks. The German assault group suffered heavy losses in Nizhnekamskoye from artillery fire from the northeast and tank fire from the west. At 20:00, the 63rd Group, advancing on Nizhnekamskoye, was stopped by heavy fire 500 meters south of this settlement. There was a delay in the release of a battalion of the 40th Group, which was to join the tank group for a strike on Gromoslavka. It could not be released until 2:30 on the 20th. Half an hour later, after heavy fighting, the locality was cleared of the enemy, and from a small bridgehead captured on the north bank, it was possible to repel counterattacks and take 50 prisoners. During the previous 24 hours, the total number of prisoners had totaled several hundred. At 4:30 a.m., we were deciding whether to send a tank group along the south bank eastwards to the Gromoslavka area, as time was running out and the situation in Nizhnekamskoye remained uncertain. With the support of large reinforcements, the enemy broke through to this settlement. Brutal street battles broke out, in which the commander of the 63rd Grenadier Regiment, Lieutenant Colonel Beets, the commander of one of the battalions, and many others were killed. The regiment suffered heavy losses. In such a situation, the tank regiment's offensive on Gromoslavka had to be cancelled, as it was needed to restore our position in Nizhnekamskoye. I was on the alert, and at dawn began the attack. We moved slowly, and before noon on 20 December, we had failed to gain a foothold in this settlement. After noon, a reinforced tank group could go to Gromoslavka. There was no continuation of the attack, because the enemy occupied the dominant heights and was able to prevent any offensive action. Over the next 2 days, the 6th Panzer Division was pulled back. It held its position only on a tiny bridgehead north of the coastal section. The Corps had to go on the defensive and take up positions in depth. This was the only way to help maintain communications with the surviving units. It was indeed a total defeat. The enemy had obviously put into battle powerful forces. What I had feared at the beginning of the operation to save the 6th Army was beginning to come true. The Russians were not going to allow one weak corps to steal from them a grand victory at Stalingrad, especially after our offensive had advanced us 30 kilometers to that great city. The attempt to save the 6th Army should have been abandoned. My division suffered heavy losses. 300 men may seem a small fraction of the division's total strength of 10,000 men. But since these 300 came mostly from the weakened Grenadier Regiment, they were relatively large. The regiment was now commanded by a lieutenant. But in addition to the losses, sleepless nights and 20-degree frost had exhausted all the combat units. They no longer perceived words of encouragement on the march. Any encouragement sounded insincere. I suggested to the Corps commander to choose defensive positions in such a way that there were places near the front where soldiers could be warmed. I spent the evening of the 22nd in the least damaged tank regiment, which still had 23 combat-ready tanks. Since they had to be kept in formation, they entrenched themselves, taking up a circular defense. The crews, at least, could take shelter in the tanks from the harsh penetrating wind. The officers lit a small fire to warm their frozen limbs. Desperation and uncertainty reigned all around. The division's operations office and command post were so close to the front line that they remained vulnerable to the enemy for long periods of time. However, this morale boosted the troops. The command post was still on the northern bridgehead of the southern section of the river, from where my division had led the entire corps 4 days earlier. This bridgehead now had a perimeter of 30 kilometers and was held by 4 exhausted divisions. I was trembling at the prospect of receiving a new order from higher headquarters to stand to the last man, to the last bullet. That would be the end of our division. Christmas Eve had been a terrible day, and the enemy was seeping in wherever he could at the junctures of battalions. Henceforth, there was no concerted defense, no reliable communication between its separate nodes. One battalion was surrounded and destroyed by enemy tanks. In the early morning of the 25th, the division headquarters moved to the south bank. A pontoon bridge was built on the split ice. The salvation of the battalion still on the north side of the river depended on this bridge, as the newly arrived infantry unit, the only fresh and in fighting condition, was to cross to the north side. Its counterattacks would have weakened the enemy's onslaught on our troops, without which our withdrawal would not have succeeded. However, the overall operational situation also deteriorated. The corps was threatened with encirclement from the eastern flank, which since the strange summer offensive in the Caucasus defended quite weak units. Therefore, it was decided to use the 17th Panzer Division as a mobile reserve, placing it behind the 23rd Panzer Division, which was to be withdrawn. This replacement, under enemy fire, of some battle-worn battalions by others equally exhausted, could only have been caused by so-called out-of-the-saddle orders. Each regiment was reduced to 180 to 200 bayonets, and the temperature had fallen to 30 degrees below zero. On the 25th, as darkness fell, I moved a little away from the river and took up a command post in the front line, while headquarters was preparing a field command post for an operational command group a little further to the rear. During the first hours of darkness, I was in the front line and used an alcohol burner to make tea from the supplies I always had with me. The supply officer had contrived to make a Christmas cake. In the clear, cold air, the steppes seemed to stretch as far as the horizon. These vast expanses absorbed the sounds of battle, which seemed muffled. The stars sparkled brightly in the sky. The failure of the rescue operation can be explained by several reasons. The Army headquarters had to know the scale of the Stalingrad disaster. There were heated discussions between the Chief of Army Staff and Hitler regarding the retreat of the 6th Army and the attempted breakthrough. There is no need to waste words discussing Hitler's senseless decision to leave the 6th Army where it was. More controversial is the question of whether the officers of the OK Gaulle and General Staff correctly assessed the impact of this defeat on the outcome of the war. Here, as with some similar events in World War II, there is a danger of obscuring the historical truth. The blame for this defeat is attributed solely to Hitler's decision, but as a result they leave out of sight the actual danger of this defeat, which was already evident at the time of the encirclement of the 6th Army, and to compensate for it, apparently, was no longer possible. It was a brilliant move by Stalin to order the encirclement of Paulus' army by frontal strikes on both flanks, where it was easy to break the weak Romanian and Italian allies of Germany. After the encirclement, the German High Command should have recognized the fact that the enemy had seized the initiative. The Russians now had 2 courses of action. They could allow a significant part of their advancing troops, encircling Stalingrad from the north and east, to complete the destruction of the 6th Army, which would allow them to use the growing forces for an offensive on other parts of the front. Or they could have used a more daring and classical method of holding back the 6th Army with a very small force, and then used the freed-up troops to attack west of the Don against the almost defeated and incapable Italian and Romanian units, push them to the southwest, occupy the crossings across the Don, and thus cut off in the Caucasus the 1st Tank Army and the 4th Army fighting east of the Don. The attempted operation to rescue the 4th Tank Army between the Don and the Volga did not rule out any of these options. If the Russians had decided, as they actually did, to keep their main forces around Stalingrad, this would have been enough to contain the 6th Army, which was becoming less and less dangerous with each day of the siege. But if the Russians had decided to use the available forces to strike Rostov and advanced in that direction, which also happened, but not so quickly, the offensive actions of the 4th Panzer Army would in any case have stopped. Its rear communications would have been under constant threat. It was characteristic of the Russians during the Second World War that their successful battles ended not with unambiguous decisions that could lead to the final result, but with one or another compromise, which was becoming customary. So it also turned out in Stalingrad. The second of these options, apparently, seemed to the Soviet High Command too risky, because, despite the victory, during the pursuit, the Russians would have to defend their outstretched flanks. By launching an offensive west of the Don, the Soviet High Command could not only throw superior forces against the 4th Tank Army, but also threaten its now inevitable retreat. And the Russians would not need much strength to achieve superiority over the 4th Tank Army, consisting of 1 weak corps with the 17th and 23rd Tank Divisions, whose combat effectiveness after long battles was very low. That is why this corps could not participate in the offensive of the 57th Corps after the arrival of the 17th Panzer Division. But if someone was still mistaken in assuming that the corps reinforced by the 17th Division would be able to break through to join the encircled army, the question remained, how could the hungry and not very mobile 6th Army be withdrawn through a narrow corridor 100 kilometers wide, while being subjected to the most brutal attacks? It was clear that there were not enough forces to defend its outstretched flanks. The difficulties of such a defense had already been voiced when assessing the previous actions of the 17th Panzer Division, when it had to add 3 battalions to protect the threatened left flank. The final decision of the commander of the 57th Panzer Corps was to place the 17th Panzer Division behind the 6th Panzer Division, which occupied a small and vulnerable from all sides bridgehead, and then as a striking force to send the latter to the offensive on a very narrow section of the front towards the 6th Army. I personally witnessed what happened in the direction of the main strike, and I am convinced that at this stage the 6th Army could no longer go to the breakthrough in connection with the 4th Tank Army, because they had fuel for only 30 kilometers. Moreover, the 4th Army was losing its fighting strength every day. By the night of 10 December, battalions of the 17th Panzer Division had already 3 days and 3 nights of fierce fighting in the cold below 15 degrees, and only that night lost 275 people killed, which is equal to the combat strength of 1 battalion. One could calculate how many more days and nights the 2 divisions would hold out at this rate of loss. This showed once again how erroneous it was to ignore the exhaustion of the personnel in assessing the situation. Only those who saw the expression on the faces of our soldiers, listless with fatigue, even in those units where morale was quite high, could appreciate the loss of their fighting ability and physical strength. The decision to terminate the rescue operation was imposed, as is always the case in war, by the victorious side. For weeks the 17th and 23rd Panzer Divisions fought their way back east of the Don, constantly under threat of defeat or encirclement, while the 6th Army was left abandoned to its fate. My opinion of the situation, which I give here, was shared by many officers at the time. What we could not realize at the time was that the Battle of Stalingrad turned out to be one of several decisive battles of the Second World War, not only because it was marked by the loss of an entire army in the most dismal of circumstances, but also because it was the climax after which defensive action was imposed on the Axis powers. The Allied military capabilities had clearly proved their superiority. Nevertheless, the war did not end at this turning point, but stretched on for years. Among other things, it shows how powerful the means of defense had become thanks to the mobility of the motorized armies and their equipment with armor that could prevent the enemy from making full use of tank breakthroughs. However, this does not mean that the defeated side, having lost the initiative, has any chance of changing the outcome of the war. After a battle like Stalingrad, it was time for strategy to be determined by politicians, provided they wanted to end the war. It has been suggested in hindsight that the demise of the Sixth Army ensured the withdrawal of the 1st Panzer Army from the Caucasus. Indeed, the Sixth Army's prolonged resistance was one of the factors that made it possible for the 4th and 1st Panzer Armies to link up. But it is a weak consolation to lose one army to save another. To finish the war, it is necessary to have a viable government, and not one that has already decided in the event of defeat to withdraw itself. In other words, to remain politically passive, and which denies the principle of Clausewitz IV about the subordination of the military to the opinion of politicians. The experience of command, of those days of fighting described above, 17, 18, and 19 December, had some features that at that time became typical of many armored divisions. The division commander personally led the advanced forces of a powerful and mobile assault group. Such a technique was based on the following principles. 1. Control of the operation at the time of the main strike directly by the division commander, who utilizes his combat experience and applies personal authority. 2. Close combat cooperation between the 3 main branches of the forces, tanks, infantry, artillery, under his direction. 3. Separation of duties between the division commander, who is with the forward striking units, and the Chief of Staff Operations, who is permanently stationed at the field command post. The practice of tactical control from the forward position was inherited from the cavalry and continued in the tradition honoring German panzer divisions. In the meantime, however, conditions had changed radically. During the offensive in Poland, France, and to a lesser extent in Russia in 1941 to 1942, the panzer divisions were so equipped with tanks that the climax of the battle depended entirely on this type of armament. Since these tank squadrons were launched into battle in the manner of the old cavalry attack, with the aim of cutting deeply into the enemy's defenses despite the fire of his artillery, the division commander could hope to maintain control of his constantly moving units if he himself moved with one of the tank waves and gave orders by radio. It was a technique used in the early stages of any campaign when the enemy was either caught by surprise, hopelessly weak, or indecisive in defense. Since then, however, the nature of warfare itself has imposed changes both in the form of attack and in the organization of the division. In decisive battles, it was no longer out of the question to face a weak enemy, nor could the balance between the 2 opposing sides be maintained for long periods. Tanks were no longer confronted with weak defensive positions, but were countered by often powerful armored forces. On the fronts, it was no longer possible to make here and their breakthroughs hundreds of kilometers deep, and the former queen of battlefields, infantry, demonstrated its value in a brutal, purposeful battle. Still, infantry could not operate in isolation. As before, it needed artillery, but now it also needed tanks if it was to confront the enemy offensively and defensively. Motorization and close attachment to tanks made infantry as mobile as tanks, if not more so. Therefore, combat became characterized by rapid changes and a constantly changing environment. Artillery was still needed. Equipped with tractors and self-propelled guns, it had to be as mobile as tanks and infantry. At this stage of the war, the German High Ground Forces Command capitalized on the shortage of material. It left panzer divisions like my 17th in the condition I have described above, without making any attempt to make them combat-ready again. Such weakened divisions met the operational requirements of the moment. For the most part, they stayed where they were needed rather than using new material to make up for the losses of those divisions engaged in combat. Tank units were operating on all parts of the front, but no longer anywhere in the massive numbers needed at the start of the invasion. Although tactics had changed fundamentally in many respects, one thing remained unchanged in all the engagements I have described. The mobility of combat control remained an important factor. But he who controls mobile combat operations must be able to observe the battlefield, know the terrain, and expect his orders to be carried out quickly. It does not matter whether the combat team is led by a division commander or, as previously envisaged, by a brigade commander. But it is desirable that he should not at the same time be the commander of one of the units of the three main branches of the troops that are to cooperate in the battle. In my division, there were no brigade commanders anymore, so it was so important for me to personally lead the front line and the most important battle group. The division's tank corps was small and required tight control. Since the outcome of the battle, as always, depended on the tanks, the division commander had to be on top of the situation. The tactics of using tanks had also changed considerably. They were no longer sent in a fixed direction deep in the rear of the enemy, but, like cavalry, used to consolidate the success already half achieved by the infantry. If in this case they encountered a defensive line not yet ripe for attack, they were usually withdrawn and aimed in another direction, where there were more prospects for success with fewer casualties. To be able to control the tank battle, the division commander usually moved behind the second wave of tanks during the decisive attack and did not have to be directly involved in the battle. Forward tanks must engage in a rapid duel at short ranges with limited visibility, and this is not the place from which to keep an eye on the entire battlefield. It is realistic if you stay a few hundred meters behind the fighting tanks. True, there the commander is vulnerable to enemy artillery fire, but he is out of range of his tanks, otherwise he would be threatened by all opposing forces. Depending on the combat situation, the division commander will frequently change his position between the tank and infantry battle groups. When he is constantly in the infantry position, he is more comfortable and relaxed in observing the battle. Periodically he moves to a forward command post between the tanks and infantry. For this purpose, he uses a commander's tank or armored vehicle equipped with 2 radio transmitters to keep in continuous communication with his battle groups. He does not require an officer watching ahead for artillery. Before the battle begins, each battery is tasked with providing support to a specific battle group. As part of that group, each battery has its own observation officer. The artillery regiment commander, who, as before, must command the whole regiment, keeps in touch with the division commander through the chief of operations of his headquarters, who is in the rear at a fixed command post. On the advance of the infantry, the commander gets an idea of the enemy's strength, his fighting order and intentions. Artillery fire is directed from the enemy's anti-tank barrages. The enemy's artillery fire gives accurate information about his power and his chosen direction of main attack. The overall picture is formed when there is a protracted and indecisive battle, and the division commander does not expose his infantry to unnecessary risk. Now it is time for the division commander, who, together with the tank group commander, is overseeing the battle, to give the tanks the order to go on the attack. If the attack meets unexpected resistance in one area, it is moved to another area where the artillery is used to weaken the enemy's anti-tank defenses until they are ripe for attack. The tank group commander who moves forward within or beyond the sight of his division commander knows that he is not obliged to bring the attack to a climax. Depending on his own chosen tactics, he may interrupt it and resume it at the point that promises him the best prospects.